Hey everyone, and welcome as we continue our study through the New Testament, looking at the New Testament church. And if you've been following along with us, then, or if you haven't been following along with us, we are studying the Bible, the New Testament, sorry, in chronological order all the way through. We did this last year with the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and now we're doing it with the rest of the New Testament. And so we've been in First Corinthians for a couple of weeks here, and now we're in First Corinthians 10. This is actually the whole chapter of First Corinthians 10 from 10:1 to 11:1. And so I'm not going to read this to you all today. This is long. There's a lot in it. So please take the time to read this. I'm going to go through the notes and explain it. So if you want to pause and read that first, and then come back as we go through the notes. But basically, what Paul is doing here is using the idolatry of Israel to teach them the lesson of, especially around the food and the things sacrificed to idols here, and participating in those sacrifices. Even though they're not real. So we'll look at that as we go through that. As always, I encourage you to subscribe to our channel if you haven't done so. That way you get the notifications, you see the alerts when we publish daily. And like I said, this is a daily study, and so we do this. Try to send these out every morning when I'm able. But as always, appreciate those who follow along. And if you find it useful, ask that you share this. So please take the time to read the 10 through 1 through 11. Like I said, I don't like to read the long sections because I don't personally like to be read to. I think most people don't like to be read to, like to read for themselves. And so please take the time to do that, study that. It probably take you about 15-20 minutes to read through that whole chapter. But looking at this, right, First Corinthians 10, all of 10:1 through 11:1, is the lessons from idolatry. And so to make vivid the possibility of disqualification, right, being disqualified from the reward of heaven, Paul drew on the Exodus. He talked about the Exodus and uses this as a parallel to what they're doing. And it says those Hebrews enjoyed unique access to God. They did. They were all under the cloud of God's presence and were baptized into Moses. And it talks about them being covered in the cloud and those type of things. And yet most of them, right, who were under the protection ended up being struck down. And we're gonna talk about that. And so the phrase they all ate same spiritual food points back to God's daily provisions. If you remember in the Exodus, he provided manna for them while they were in the wilderness daily. And so this was something that was there. You can go back to Deuteronomy 8 and read about that if you want to. And so the wilderness generation served as a cautionary example to the Corinthian church, which was which was on the verge of provoking God, because they did, right? The wilderness generation, the people of the Exodus did, they provoked God to the several times. And so the Corinthians here were apparently boasting that they could please the Lord and at the same time partake of food, and not only partake of the food, but it was the food and the fellowship at pagan, what we would call religious clubs, uh, pagan religious cultures. Now, this isn't like, oh, you went to a bar where they or you went to a bar where they serve food and drink, right? Those type of things. It'd be like going to a strip club type of thing and eating food there and saying, oh, well, that's no big deal, because I'm not partaking in that. I'm just here to eat the food, and that would be the kind of the parallel here, because a lot of the things that happen in these pagan clubs were like we've talked about this before. Their worship was very sexual in many cases, and so also it's tied to a lot of demonic activity. We're going to see that a little bit here. And so the Corinthian motto was everything is permissible. And Paul says, yeah, everything's permissible, but everything is good, right? It's not all good. And so Paul continued to remind them of the Old Testament examples. And so the phrase "now these things," he says that multiple times in this, refers to the idolatrous activities of the wilderness generation that provoked God to cut them down. And so there was this prohibition on things, and Paul talks about three things, in the Greek that becomes paradigm to these. And there's three things that he talks about that God destroyed them, that judged and destroyed the people of their sins for. The first one was sexual immorality, right? You see that in Numbers 25 verses 1 through 18 if you want to go back and read that. And so he says, then they put him to the test, which was in Numbers 21. They tested him. They put Christ to the test, or the Corinthians were putting Christ to the test. The Exodus generation put God to the test. And then the third one was complaining, right? And that was in Exodus 12 and in Numbers 16. You can look at that. And so all three of these Old Testament examples Paul uses to show that God judged and destroyed the people for their sins because of what they were doing. And so God's judgment on the wilderness generation served as a cautionary tale for the Corinthian believers who thought they were strong enough to participate in these pagan religious functions without compromise, right? And escape judgment at the end of the age. And it's just like, oh, I can, everything's, I'm able to do this. I can do this, right? I think sometimes us as Christians, we get caught. It's like, oh, well, I can participate in this because, it doesn't affect me. Well, we know that things like that do sinful activities, right? Whether you're actually involved in the sexual activity or not, or sorry, sinful activity or not, has an influence on you and affects you, right? You may not be doing the sinful act, but if you're around it or part of it, in the environment of it, it's going to have an effect on you. And Paul talks about that. Paul called the Corinthians to recognize their impeding accountability for the Lord for what they were doing. And Paul wanted the Corinthians to know that the participants, and he uses the Lord's Supper here as kind of a parallel to the eating that they were doing and the activities, their celebration and worship, type of worship they were doing, and versus the Lord's Supper and partaking of the Lord's Supper and the eating and the fellowship that we have in there. And so the Lord's Supper represents a unified body, right? That is dependent on the death of Christ, right? United participation as one body in the Lord's Supper, right? It points to a united fellowship brought about by Christ's death, as well as each individual's believer's union with Christ. And so we're all one. That celebration, the Lord's Supper that we celebrate, right, is a representation of us all being one in the death and resurrection of Christ. And so he starts to, in verse 14, he talks about this actual idolatry that he's using or pointing to here, not merely just the partaking of food offered to idols. Like he said, there's nothing wrong with eating food offered to idols. We've already talked about that a couple of days ago, but it's the act of eating that food that's offered to idols in as part of their worship or as part of their civil, what we would call a public activity and stuff like that was going on. This wasn't like they were taking food, and Paul talks about this a little bit. It's not like they were taking food from, that was offered to these idols, like then taking it home and then eating it in their own private. This was a very public thing. And so participation in these, right, in these idolatrous rites is a violation of the believer's union with Christ, and thus with the one body relationship that they had with the other believers. And so therefore the Lord's Supper and the table of demons are mutually exclusive, right? He says you can't be partaking in the Lord's Supper and then also be taking part in the demon, if you want to call it, right, or the activities of demon-like behavior in public. And it's what he's saying. Now, you can't say, oh, you can't partake of the Lord's Supper on Sunday and then through the week be eating, with these people who are worshiping demonic things. He's like, this is demonic. Like, we know, he says, the idols aren't real. We know these gods aren't real, but the demonic activity behind this is. And so he's like, you don't need to be participating in that. And so, so Paul prohibited participation in pagan realistic meals because they involved intimacy with demons, and that's what he's pointing to. And so he continued to affirm, like I just mentioned, the non-reality of idols and of deities and these false gods. But demons are both real and powerful, and we need to understand that. And so he didn't want the Corinthians to discount the demonic presence at the table of demons, right? What he referred to as the table of demons. He didn't want it to understand that, like, yes, these gods that aren't real, but the demonic activity behind this worship, behind all this is very real and it's very powerful. And so he refers back to the idolatrous Israel in the wilderness here, when they overlooked the demonic presence in their amongst their activities, just as the Corinthian believers were tempted to do. The Corinthians were tempted to overlook this, and it's like, oh, it's just, we know they're not real. Everything's permissible. We can do this. Like, no, you're getting buddy with demonic activity when you do this, and you need to stop. You don't need to do this. This is not good, right? You don't need to be participating in this. And so Paul called the Corinthian believers to remember the example of Israel when they provoked the Lord to jealousy by their idolatry, and which resulted in a plague. And so he's like, look, remember, this is what happened. And so he finishes off with 10:32 through 11:1, and he concludes the train of thought that he began. So going all the way back to chapter 8, right? He goes all the way back to that, and he summarizes the principles that believers should limit the exercise of their freedom. Something he's talked about. Right? He started started with us at 8, and then we talked about the food of sacrifice, the idol. He talked about giving up our rights, that type of things, and he goes on. And so basically 8 through 11, or 8 through the end of 10, or through 11:1, is one long thought about this. And basically it's the idea that we should limit the exercise of our freedoms, especially out of consideration for those who may have weak consciences. And so, he kind of gives these warnings and these things of what we're to do, how we're to behave, right? Not to get puffed up. All this points back to the arrogance. That's kind of the leading thing, right? Just because you think you're okay, and just because you think you can do these things, doesn't mean that you necessarily should be, right? I think Paul says at one point, all things are permissible, but not all things are good, and so we need to be very careful in what we're doing in our behavior, and especially those who, we think that we're stronger in the faith, and some of us may be stronger in the faith, but we got to look out for our weaker brother and sisters in the faith, and understand that our behavior can impact them as well. And that's what he's talking about here. So we just need to be very, very careful with what we associate with, who we associate with. Now, it doesn't mean we don't hang out with people who aren't Christians. That's probably one of the bigger problems in Christianity right now, is to become more of a country club, and we only know Christians, only hang out with Christians, and only talk to Christians who believe, look, and think like us. And so it's like we put ourselves in this bubble. He's not talking about that. But what he's also saying is, don't go out and get involved in things that are demonic, right? Don't go to places that you shouldn't be going to, especially if they could cause another brother or sister to stumble. And so just kind of some common sense knowledge that we're using here about how we're to behave. And so he wraps this up again, and with the main thought. He wraps this main thought of looking out for your brother and sister in Christ, right? How is your actions, how is your behavior going to affect them? We need to pay attention to that and learn from that, and also learn from the idolatry and the downfall of Israel and their arrogance and their things that they got caught up in. Make sure you don't get caught up in that too, and don't be a stumbling block to others. So to finish that thought, right? He finishes that thought there with 11:1. Now, what we're going to transition to here, and tomorrow's, I'm just tell you right now, tomorrow's is going to be a longer, a little bit deeper lesson, because he now shifts from this subject to chapters 11 through 14, right, of the Corinthians, is his writing on instruction for proper worship. And so basically what he's looking at when he shifts into chapter 11, he is looking at, okay, how are you behaving during the worship service? All right, so everything from 11 to 14 is about public worship. Now, it can apply to other things in our life. There's going to be some things in there, some people don't realize this, that what he is talking about in Acts 11 through 14 is the worship service, and how we are to behave and how we are to be in public service. And so there's a lot we're going to dive into, because there's going to be some of these things where I'm going to lay them out, and the word probably is going to be in there a lot, because honestly, most scholars aren't 100% sure. And because, again, like we've talked about early on in this, when I first started this, is there's a lot of things in here that is an answer to a letter that they wrote. And so sometimes we don't know if he's quoting them or if it's a response to them. And so there's some things that we're just not 100% sure of. But as we dive into this, I think you'll learn a lot from this, especially this first section in 11, and then when we get to 14, you're going to see it in a way I think maybe it hasn't been taught to you before. Well, at least for some people. Some people I know have been taught this way. But looking at how things, especially when it goes around men and women in worship, and it's actually less men and women, but husbands and wives is the main focus, and we'll see that, and we'll dive into that a little bit. But I hope you do take the time to listen to the one tomorrow. I think that's gonna be a very important one, I think, for a lot of people to get a clear understanding of what worship service look like, and probably should look like in our worship service today. So as always, I hope you learn from these. If you have any questions, comments, anything, put them in there, send them to us. We appreciate the conversation. But as always, appreciate everyone who takes the time to watch.